This video is going to look at some potential hints for providing effective feedback in educational settings. One of the key elements of the EAT framework, and in particular subdimension AF1, is that feedback needs to be accessible to the learner. So feedback needs to be understandable, it needs to be motivational, and it needs to feed forward to future learning. A key thing to consider is the emotive impact of feedback. Good feedback can lead to students getting greater senses of motivation. Limited or negative feedback can lead to students feeling demotivated and not wanting to develop their learning and improve. As this graph from Jones and colleagues in 2012 shows, the impact of feedback can be extremely motivational. So a large number of these respondents on the survey found that the feedback motivated them or motivated them very strongly, and some found that it demotivated them. So a key thing with feedback is that it has potentially really positive effects on students if it's delivered in an appropriate way. So this video is giving you 15 top tips on providing motivational and supportive feedback. Tip 1, be positive. So the first one is being positive and being friendly. Students in general need to feel positive reinforcement. So if something is good, say so, and say why. Just saying good or excellent or well done as a piece of feedback doesn't really help, because it doesn't explain to the students what they did right. Sometimes they'll do something that's good or something that's really effective without realizing that they were doing that. So it's important to explain why something is good. What about it was actually good, to be specific. If you need to provide criticism on something they didn't do well, the key thing is to try and do that in a supportive way. So a softened negative, such as next time do it this way, or next time it would be better if you did this, is a really powerful way of doing that. And in particular, focusing on the work rather than the person. So a good way to improve a feedback comment would be, a good way to improve this approach or this essay or this report would be this, rather than you need to do this or you need to do that. Point to areas of strength that can be developed, and think of the idea of the feedback sandwich, which is saying something good, something that needs improving, and then following it up with a positive comment at the end. The converse to that is don't be confrontational. Students haven't developed thick skins yet. Students don't understand that robust feedback isn't meant to be aggressive. Direct focus on robust feedback can come across as an extremely argumentative and extremely aggressive approach. So they haven't developed those thick skins that seasoned academics have by the time that we come to publish papers or write grants or chapters of books and things. If students feel that feedback is a negative experience for them, that they're demotivated by it, that they feel negatively impacted by it, they will avoid reading their feedback. And you can see that if you talk to students about why they're not collecting their feedback or why they're not reading or utilizing their feedback. Usually it's because they've learned it's an unpleasant experience for them. So avoid things that are terse comments like no or exclamation marks, or you do see them sometimes, absolutely avoid those. And if you need to critique something, focus again on the work rather than the person. So it's focusing on the essay or the report or the summary or the presentation rather than you didn't do this or you need to improve that. A key thing to remember is that when you get given a piece of work to evaluate, that could be the best piece of work that student has ever produced. Even if it's a low class or a low grade or a poor piece of work, for that student it could be the best thing they've ever done. For you it might look like something quite limited, so be positive and supportive about things even if they look like they're not very good. The third point is to make sure you're explicit about the things that you're referring to. So single words don't actually mean anything. Words like yes, no, good, excellent, referencing, ticks, crosses, those sorts of things, they don't actually mean anything or convey any information. If you use the word excellent, what exactly is it that was excellent? Was it phrased excellently? Was it a good point that they were making? Is that a good piece of research, or was it a good piece of critical analysis? So say what was excellent and what was good about it. Explaining exactly what you mean is really, really important. And you can use things like quick marks in software like Turnitin's Feedback Studio, or copied and pasted comments that explain things in a more detailed way, so you can prepare those before you do the actual marking, so that you're not having to write out lengthy bits of description when you're providing the feedback. and not just focusing on the negatives. So students, anyone really, needs to know that they did well, and they need to know why it's good, and they need to have that positive reinforcement. So be specific as to why it's good. Encourage them to use these approaches again in the future, and encourage students to share what they did well with other students as well, so they can all learn from the positive things that they did right and the things they did effectively. The fifth tip is clearly explain what the students need to do to get a higher mark. So this is really focused more around justifying the mark than feedback per se, but what do they need to keep doing and what do they need to avoid doing? What things do they need to do differently next time? Again, think about the context of the student's aims or needs. For example, there's no point in giving a huge amount of really detailed feedback about how they can expand their ideas and expand their conceptual frameworks if this is a repeat piece of work and the student's mark is going to be capped at the 40 or 50% level. So think of what the context of what they're doing in that particular moment actually is. Aligning feedback to the learning outcomes and marking criteria is important. So the students need to understand what they did that aligned well with the expectations you had of a particular activity or a particular requirement in the assessment guidance. So focusing on skills, things they did well, activities they did well, approaches they did well or need to improve, rather than specific content. For example, focusing on critical analysis, appraisal, use of evidence, developments of an argument, rather than you got this right, you got that wrong, or you need to include a full stop or a comma here or there. Don't ignore the factual content, but it's more important to focus on the skills or the things that you're evaluating rather than detailed minutiae. Thinking about feeding forward to the next time they need that particular skill. The next tip is to design the feedback when you design the assessment. So often people design an assessment or set an assessment, and then the feedback is almost an afterthought of what they'll provide once the students have submitted that assessment. So a key thing to think of is how are you supporting the development of a particular academic skill. The first thing to say is what skill is this assessment developing? Then think how is the best way to guide students in the use of that particular skill, and what would I expect them to be able to do differently after they've done this particular assessment? What's the very best way to achieve that difference, to achieve that level of growth? And so how can you design an assessment that provides opportunities to achieve those new ways of thinking and those new ways of approaching things? So thinking of the way in which you're going to guide the student in how they can develop and how they can do things differently. It's important when you're thinking about an assessment because you can then build the assessment to provide those opportunities. This next point is really important. Too much feedback is as bad as too little. So students can't change everything about their learning activities. And if you provide them with 40 different things of what they need to change, they won't be able to do all of that. They'll only do a small selection of those. So it's important to focus on the things they can change that will have the most impact on their development and the most impact on their future work. So if you absolutely carpet the work with minor comments, the students will probably miss the really important points, the really key things they can do to make a significant improvement on their activity and on their learning. So avoid commenting over much on small things like spelling errors, grammar, punctuation, small factual errors. You can do a blanket comment of those at the end. So for example, there are a large number of spelling mistakes in this assessment. Find a way of proofreading your work before you submit it. That's a single blanket comment and you don't have to point out every single error. A good way of really focusing these down is a concept known as the feedback 5 or the feedback 7. The idea behind the feedback 5 is to identify 2 things the student did well, 2 things the student could improve on, and 1 key thing to remember for next time. That's 5 things that you're focusing on and 1 thing to remember for next time. That 1 thing could be good, it could be bad, it could be something the student's doing well, or it could be something the student needs to improve or learn how to do. But 2 things they did well and why, 2 things they need to improve on and how, and 1 key thing to remember for next time that they need to keep doing or change. The feedback 7 is the same idea, but it's focusing on 3 things they did well, 3 things they could improve on, and 1 thing for them to remember for next time. This sort of approach can work really well with asking them for things they might like feedback on. I'll talk about that in a moment, but getting the student to suggest 3 things they'd like feedback on fits nicely with this. So then you've got 10 things that are key things the student can focus on, and they know what is going to have a substantive impact on their learning. That last point I just mentioned is another really important and useful way of getting effective feedback, which is to ask the students what feedback they actually want. So asking the student to define 3 things they would like feedback on is a really good way of identifying aspects that they would like to learn or would like to develop, because the things we focus on might not necessarily be the things that they really feel they need to improve. But it's a good idea to give them a limited number of these rather than saying, what would you like feedback on? Because often you'll get the response, everything. But if you ask them to define 3 things, that encourages them to prioritize things that they want the most support about. So you can give extensive feedback on those areas and some cursory feedback on other things. And this is a good thing to combine with the feedback 5 or feedback 7 approach to provide a limited number of things for the student to focus on that will have the biggest impact. The next tip is making feedback a dialogue. Feedback should be a 2-way thing. It's not something that the educator is giving to the learner or giving to the student. It should be something that you're providing as guidance. And develop a rationalization for talking through that and talking through it with others. So if you've got too much marking or the students aren't reading their feedback, then the key thing to maybe really do is focus on a summary of 5 or 6 things, or the feedback 5 or feedback 7 approach, and then say, here's a few focus things for you to really focus on. If you want to come and talk to me about it, there's a chance to come and ask questions, or you can provide them with a means of doing that asynchronously through some sort of an email or a Dropbox survey questionnaire or something similar. Bear in mind that the students who most need feedback are less likely to come and talk to you in person about it, so you need to provide a safe space for that to work. Highlighting when you're giving feedback to students is a really important thing to do. So emphasizing that feedback is not just comments on written work, feedback is any sort of guidance that you give to a student. And that could be discussions in an informal meeting, or you may be talking to the student after class, or it could be meetings you might have as a supervisor with the student if they're doing a project or a dissertation with you, or a PhD. So those sorts of meetings between a supervisor and the student, you can facilitate the feedback by maybe getting them to fill in a particular form. Very simple things to reflect on, with key outputs that they did, things that they could improve on, things to remember in future, and then objectives for the next meeting. So getting them to really think on how they're using that interactive ability, that verbal feedback, and emphasizing that verbal feedback is important, because usually they consider feedback to be only written comments on a script. The next top tip is trying to make feedback reflective. In order to get students to use the feedback, it helps to get them to think about the feedback comments. So there's a very strong argument that if feedback doesn't change the way the student learns or the student approaches a task, then it isn't feedback, it's just words. So really getting the students to reflect on the feedback they previously had on a skill, if you're assessing that skill within a particular assessment that you've designed, maybe give them a mark that requires them to reflect on that feedback. So for example, what did they do well in the last assignment? What did they need to avoid or improve or change and develop? How have they applied feedback to this current assignment? So those 4 questions are very easy to do. Get the students to reflect on that. It encourages them to look back on the feedback they had previously, and it will mean they can do that with a fairly neutral eye. Whereas if they looked at feedback when they received the feedback initially, they might have had a sort of fairly negative emotive response to that. And if you provide them that little gap of time, it means they have a much better chance of using that feedback objectively. The next approach is really powerful, and that's providing audio or video feedback. This is really good way of conveying information to the students, and it takes a fairly short amount of time to provide some really good feedback. So you can use audio feedback either using a dictaphone or a smartphone or audio recording software on a computer. And what I usually do is I annotate the script with a number or a letter, and then you unpause the recording device and say, right, feedback point B, and then you describe what the feedback actually is. You can do the same with screen capture using a video, and you can actually mark the assignment in real time. They can then see you going through those thought processes, and you can highlight something on the screen and talk about that. The key thing is it's your tone of voice, and that's really, really important. It personalises the feedback. It means that students can hear when you're happy and that they've done something well, and also that you're disappointed when they've done something that's not as good. Actually, both of those are motivators for the student, and it means that often what could be considered as quite abrupt comments in written feedback actually comes across more supportive and in a positive way. So the tone of your voice is absolutely fundamental to this. You could also use screen capture to annotate a simple or fake answer, something that you've pre-written or from a previous cohort if you have permission, or that you can use generative AI, for example ChatGPT, to write for you. That means that you can then highlight good or limited or problematic points on a sample or fake answer, but the key thing with audio and video feedback is that tone of your voice and hearing that personalised approach. And actually you'll find that as you're recording those comments, you're also scanning through the piece of assessment to see the next point you want to talk about. So I personally have found in the past that you can provide about 15 minutes worth of content in terms of feedback on an essay that takes about 20 minutes to mark, including giving that feedback. So you're actually marking in your head as you're talking to the student in the audio or the video. So it's a really effective way of providing good, directed and supportive feedback as you do the marking process. Another effective way is to use comment banks. There are various different types of banks. You can either have ones that are electronic ones, such as you can see here. This is from Feedback Studio, which is part of the Turnitin software. But also you could use written comment banks or just a document that you've copied and pasted across as an electronic copy. I've frequently done this with hard copy written work, where the feedback is a series of comments on two sides of a piece of paper. Each one is numbered, and you can identify with a number those bits of feedback on the script. That helps you provide pre-written guidance in quite a lot of detail for things that are common areas, things that tend to come across a lot, such as poor referencing or grammatical or structural errors, or key concepts the students keep getting wrong within that particular assignment. That means that you've then got more time and opportunity to focus on the really important things that are specific to that particular assessment and that particular submission that the student has put in. It also means that you can provide links to resources, and you can combine that very well with a Feedback 7 or Feedback 5 approach to provide some bespoke comments. The final tip is phrasing feedback to encourage the student to be independent and self-critical. So what you want to do, instead of saying you did this right, you did this wrong, or that wasn't good, or that could be improved, is by trying to phrase that makes them think through the analytical process themselves. So what is it about this that you think you could have improved? Or elements of this argument are quite limiting. Think about what these key points might be. So you're getting them to focus on the key marking criteria and the key outcomes that you want, and encourage them to see the errors and the good points rather than pointing it out for them. That's a really, really important skill to develop, because they'll need that skill to evaluate their own work once they graduate and once they no longer have educators such as us looking over their shoulders and telling them what's good and what's bad. So I hope those were useful tips. Key things to consider: be supportive, be clear, don't be cryptic, and ensure that you feed forward with feedback that you provide. And in particular that it's looking to what the student needs to do next rather than overmuch what they did previously.